inverses. Inverse operations are opposite operations, which means what will bring a function back to what it was. So for inverse operations, if the operation is operation and then the opposite or the inverse operation, for example, if the operation is addition, the inverse will be subtraction. If the operation is multiplication, the inverse will be division. If it is the square, so let's say x squares the operation, the inverse that will get you the answer back will be the square root of x. Will take you back to whatever x squared was. So this is what the operation, if the operation and then the inverse operation. The reason we're doing it in this chapter is we want to find what is the inverse of y to the power ex. But before we get there, let's just quickly see what is the method of finding the inverse operation, or the inverse function in this case. So if I have, let's say we have y equals x plus 3, so the inverse operation of plus 3 should be minus 3. But what we're going to do is we're going to have a few steps to do this. And the first step is to say inverse is, if you don't use this as your first step, I'll show you now what's going to happen. So your first step, say inverse is, so I'm going to say inverse is, and what I'm going to do now is my second step, I'm going to say you swap x with y. Okay, swap x with y. Let's see if I can focus a little bit better. If I swap x with y, it means that wherever I have an x, I'm going to put a y, and wherever I have an x, a y, I'm going to have an x. So this will become x equals y plus 3. And what I'm going to do now in my third step is I'm going to make y the subject of the formula. Make y the subject of the formula or the equation. Okay, so we're going to get y by itself, in other words. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to swap the two sides. I'm going to say y plus 3 equals x, so I just swapped it. Now I'm going to get rid of plus 3 by subtracting 3 on this side, subtracting on that side, so y equals x minus 3. So if this was y equals x plus 3, then the inverse of y is x minus 3. So it just proved that the inverse operation of plus 3 is negative 3. Now what I said, if you don't write inverse, you can't just say inverse, you can't say y equals, then just swap x and y, because that does not equal that. The inverse does. The inverse does equal x equals y plus 3. So you have to say the inverse is, if you just leave that out, that step to that step doesn't make any sense. And this does not equal that. This y equals x minus 3 is not the same as y equals x plus 3. It is the total opposite. Now, whole purpose of doing this is to find what is the inverse of y equals ex. Okay, so the inverse is, let's find it. The inverse is, and I'm going to swap my y and my x. I'll use another color because that blue sucks. Okay, so I'm going to swap my e and my x. So x is going to be e to the power of y. Now if I want to find y, the subject of the formula, I will have to get rid of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take ln both sides. So I'm going to say ln x equals ln e to the power of y. The y is going to go to the front. It's going to come y ln e, which equals ln x. And I'm just going to carry on here so that you can see properly. Okay, now ln e equals 1, because that is log base e, and e log base e is 1. So I'll get that y equals the ln of x. So if my operation is e to the power x, if that's the operation, then the inverse of that will be ln x, and vice versa. You need to know how this method works and apply it. What you also need to know then is that if I say, go back there, y equals x plus 3, then we say that the inverse, or better say fx is x plus 3, the function in x, then the inverse function we indicate with to the power -1. So if the function is x plus 3, the inverse function, f to the power -1x, equals x minus 3. And if we look at what we proved here with green, what we say is if y equals e to the power x, then the inverse, y -1, is ln x. But more mathematically correct is instead of saying y ex, because this can be confusing, this can also mean 1 over y. So I'll rather write it as fx equals e to the power x, and the inverse of that is ln x.